They thought she was nobody, just another face in the crowd, another civilian they could brush aside without consequence. But the moment her body hit the concrete at the bottom of those stairs, everything changed. What those soldiers didn't know was that the frail woman they just shoved wasn't just anyone. She was the reason half of them were still alive. It was a scorching Tuesday afternoon at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, somewhere in the dust-choked valleys where the sun doesn't forgive, and neither does the enemy. Margaret Holloway had arrived that morning, 82 years old, moving slowly with a cane that had seen better decades. She wore a faded floral dress and carried a worn leather bag clutched tight against her chest. The gate guards barely glanced at her clearance badge, a relic from another era, they assumed, probably some bureaucratic mistake that let her through. She was there for the memorial service, they were told, a formality, nothing more. But as she made her way through the compound, something shifted in the air. Older soldiers, the ones with gray threading their temples, stopped mid-stride when they saw her. Their faces went pale, then flushed with something between shock and reverence. Whispers began to spread like wildfire through the ranks, but not fast enough. Corporal Denny Reeves and Private First Class Jake Morrison were having the worst week of their military careers, and their patience had evaporated somewhere between the 100th push-up and the failed inspection that morning. They were angry, reckless, and when they saw an old woman shuffling too slowly up the stairs to the command building, blocking their path, something ugly took over. "Move it, lady!" Reeves barked, his voice sharp with entitlement. Margaret turned slowly, her tired eyes meeting his, and for just a moment, she looked like she might say something. But before she could speak, Morrison's hand shot out and shoved her shoulder. Not hard, he'd claim later, just enough to get her moving. Except Margaret wasn't steady on her feet. Her cane clattered against the metal steps, her bag flew from her hands, and then she was falling, tumbling backward down 12 concrete stairs, while 24 witnesses stood frozen in horror. The sound of her body hitting each step echoed across the courtyard like gunshots. When she finally came to rest at the bottom, motionless, the entire base seemed to hold its breath. The photographs spilled from her open bag, scattering across the ground. Black and white images of young men in Vietnam-era uniforms, field hospitals, and a younger Margaret in nurses' scrubs covered in blood. One photo landed face-up near a lieutenant's boot. Margaret Holloway standing between two generals, a Medal of Freedom around her neck. That's when the whispers became shouts, and the shouts became a stampede of officers racing to the scene. But it was too late to undo what had been done. Within 20 minutes, 3 Black Hawks touched down on the base's landing pad. Major General Richard Kane emerged first, his face carved from stone, followed by Lieutenant General Patricia Moreno and Brigadier General James Woodward. They didn't walk. They stormed across that base like the wrath of God made flesh. No one had seen 3 generals arrive together at a forward operating base in over a decade, and certainly not with that look in their eyes. By the time they reached the medical tent where Margaret was being treated, the 2 soldiers who'd pushed her were already in flex cuffs, surrounded by MPs who looked like they wanted to do a lot more than just restrain them. The base commander, Colonel Hastings, stood at attention, sweat pouring down his face, knowing his career was about to end. General Kane knelt beside Margaret's bed, his weathered hand covering hers with a gentleness that shocked everyone watching. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I'm so sorry." Margaret's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on the man before her. "Richard?" she murmured, confused. "Little Ricky Kane? Is that you under all those stars?" Tears were streaming down the general's face now, and he didn't bother to hide them. "Yes, ma'am. It's me." He looked up at the other generals, both of whom had moved closer, their own eyes glistening. "It's us, the ones you saved." The story came out in fragments over the next hour, as medics worked on Margaret's broken ribs and the deep bruising that painted her elderly skin in shades of purple and black. Vietnam, 1971. A field hospital 20 miles from the DMZ that came under surprise attack at 0300. Margaret Holloway, just 28 years old, a civilian volunteer nurse who could have evacuated with the first wave. Instead, she stayed. For 16 hours, as mortars fell and bullets punched through the canvas walls, she worked. She stitched, she administered morphine, she held dying boys' hands and lied to them that they'd see home again. When the roof collapsed, she threw her own body over 3 critically wounded soldiers, shielding them from the debris. One of those soldiers was 19-year-old Private Richard Kane, who'd lost both legs to a landmine. Another was Corporal Patricia Moreno, with shrapnel through her chest. The third was Specialist James Woodward, bleeding out from a wound no one thought he'd survive. Margaret saved 47 soldiers that night. And when reinforcements finally arrived at dawn, they found her still working, covered head to toe in other people's blood, refusing to rest until every last wounded soldier had been stabilized. She never wore her Medal of Freedom, never spoke about that night, never asked for anything in return. She just went on living quietly, working as a school nurse for 30 years, fading into the kind of obscurity that true heroes often do. But those 3 soldiers never forgot. They rose through the ranks, carrying her memory like a sacred thing. And when they heard she was visiting a base where her grandson had served before his death in Afghanistan, they'd planned to surprise her with a ceremony. Instead, they arrived to find her broken at the bottom of a staircase, discarded by men who wore the same uniform she'd bled to protect. The base was locked down within the hour. The 2 soldiers faced court-martial and dishonorable discharge. The base commander was relieved of duty, and new protocols were implemented across every military installation worldwide about respect, awareness, and the invisible heroes who walk among us. Margaret recovered, though she never walked quite the same again. At her request, the ceremony was held 3 weeks later, not for her, but for her grandson and all the others who hadn't made it home. 3 generals stood at attention as an old woman in a wheelchair laid flowers at a memorial wall, and every soldier on that base lined up to salute her. Not because they were ordered to, but because they finally understood. The frail woman they'd overlooked wasn't just anyone. She was the very best of them, before they were even born. And sometimes the greatest warriors don't carry weapons at all. They carry compassion, courage, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for strangers who will become family in the worst moments of their lives. Margaret taught them that, not with words, but with scars that still ached on rainy days and a spirit that refused to break, even at the bottom of a staircase where cruelty thought it could win.